Thank you. And I would also like to start by saying thank you to the organizers for inviting me. And it's a great pleasure being here, presenting some of our early data on performed during this or in this project ProHealth. I'd like to say to Elias, I will not present data on the footpath today. It's E. coli that I will focus on and the vertical transmission and some aspects of biosecurity in this respect. Oops. First of all, as a small introduction, I would just mention some of these very important aspects of E. coli infections in poultry. As most of you are familiar with, we see a lot of different aspects of disease disorders, and more of them, of course, more important than others. In this project, we focus on omphalitis, York sac infections, neonatal sepsis, and of course, this is the neonatal mortality as informed by Elias. We do have focus on in this project. Of course, respiratory tract infections, as Jaakko said, is also very important when we talk about coli. Cellulitis, intestinal disease is not common in poultry. Swollen head syndrome, we also have quite a lot of literature on that, but it's definitely not within this project. Then we come to the salpingitis peritonitis disease in the laying birds. We definitely also have focus on this, as you will see in a minute. And acute septicemia of chickens and turkeys, well, very often it may be associated with the salpingitis and the peritonitis complex, so it's a bit difficult to separate. But this is a broad overview of the important conditions associated with coli in poultry, and as you see in red, this is where we have our focus. Again, just to sum it up a little bit, how this neonatal cholisepticemia may appear in flocks typically. Well, this is a very severe case, but you see the days of age of these broiler chicks here on the lower bar, and very high mortality within the first days may appear, and then we have the decrease in mortality over the days. Again, this is quite extreme, but the figure here is very common for this first week mortality. And already here, when we have the very early mortality here, day 1, day 2, we do have indications, of course, that this is vertically transmitted because they cannot catch this organism in the flocks at this stage. And so we have indications here that we have vertical transmission with this kind of curve. The pathology, of course, is dominated by general cardiovascular disturbances, hyperemia, congestion, etc. When we go to the layers, also broiler breeders, of course, and look at the salpingitis peritonitis, a common appearance in the flock would be as shown on the graph on your left, where we see with the green color, we see start of lay, and very often in association with this start of laying, we also have the coli salpingitis appearing. It's very common in Denmark at least. And of course the pathology, as you also know, may be that in the oviduct we see different amounts of pus. So not a very difficult condition to diagnose at least. It may also, as I said, progress into a quite acute form of septicemia with necrosis of liver and spleen, etc. Just a picture of the polysericitis, very commonly associated with the broilers. Again, Jaakko have some data in the analysis on the economic impact. We haven't worked a lot with this in our word packages. Also, just to document the importance of the E. coli in another way than Jaakko did, because this is some of our own previous investigations looking at layer birds, but again, it's first week mortality we are looking at here. And we published that this in 2012, and as you see, E. coli alone or in combination with other pathogens may account for almost 80% of the first week mortality in layer birds. So this is really a substantial amount of the mortality. This is actually data from, and very new data from this ProHealth project. And here we have followed 4 broiler breeder flocks. And what we see here in brief is that in the top, we have the salpingitis peritonitis diagnosed, where we have the different age groups in top during the production period. And it's far the most common diagnosis that we see in the broiler breeders. Of course, we have other interesting data from the production period and other conditions here, but again, without any doubt, salpingitis peritonitis is the most common condition. And we have seen that in Denmark, at least, for several years. Now we get some very nice data and some absolute figures here, which we are very happy to obtain, very useful for us and hopefully also for many other people around the world. So, coli, because the broiler parents, again, as you saw, we see here Escherichia coli, the microbiological findings is the blue, the green part of the cake here. And again, this is the definitely the most important microbiological finding associated the salpingitis peritonitis. Other agents may be involved, but that's only rarely seen under our conditions, at least. So with that, I think I demonstrated that E. coli in most production systems is very, very important, and from my point of view, the most economically important bacterial infection. When we move to the aspect about vertical transmission, I will start showing you some older data we presented a long time ago, it's more than 10 years ago, because we were quite interested in the aspect of vertical transmission. Is it all E. coli capable of being transmitted? Some subtypes more suited than others, etc. So we gathered some data more than 10 years ago, where we got some data from parent flocks in the broiler production, where no specific disease or increased mortality was observed. But we saw some high mortality in the broilers after these breeders. And we have the different flocks on the left, number of isolates obtained from these flocks, and we have some characteristics of these isolates. They were all resistant, have the same plasmid, same ribotype as seen up here, the genetic characterization, and there was increased mortality in some of these flocks. So basically what we showed was that from some of these broiler breeders, only one type of E. coli was transmitted to the broilers, and sometimes it caused increased mortality. So why it was only one subtype and not more, that was difficult, and it's still difficult for us to understand, I might say. We also saw some other aspects. This was also from 2002 concerning the broiler breeders, because sometimes we saw this outbreak of mortality due to peritonitis, salpingitis, and septicemia. The pattern we saw consistently for some years at least was that mortality could start in one house, in this case in house 3, the green bar here, and then after a certain time it started in another house on the same farm. Of course, indicating that this may jump between houses. And one should remember that this is farms with very high level of biosecurity, and it was difficult for us to understand basically how it was transmitted to the other houses. But the pattern with this very aggressive forms of coli, we still see that it may appear in one house and later in another house on the same farm. In this particular case, we were also characterizing the isolates from the different houses, and what we saw, again, it was the same serotype, it was the same genetic clone, you could say, same resistances, same genetic profile, so definitely it was the same subtype of coli progressing and transmitted to another house. So over the years, we have had these indications. We have had these indications that E. coli and certain subtypes may dominate and even be transmitted. From these late houses, from the broiler breeders, we saw late in the production cycle that one broiler flock originating for this farm really had increased mortality, and it was diagnosed as acute E. coli septicemia, very high mortalities, and again, this original parent stock clone was isolated from the broilers. So again, we have accumulated evidence that vertical transmission, the broiler breeders, are very important. Finally, just to show some of our earlier work with this, we saw a fluoroquinolone-resistant Escherichia coli clone within an integrated broiler operation, also being transmitted from the broiler parents, parent stock flock 2. We had this clone in quite high frequency. We found it in unhatched eggs, causing embryo mortality, and also in the hatchery. So again, accumulating evidence over the years for vertical transmission. However, in the ProHealth project, we have really tried to demonstrate this aspect in a more substantial way and have really worked a lot with it and collected a lot of data. So again, we followed the 4 parent flocks during the whole production period from 20 weeks to 60 weeks of age by post-mortem, bacteriological examination, and of randomly selected dead birds. Newly hatched chickens from each flock were swapped in the cloaca, different age groups of the parents, and the bacterial flora was analyzed. Causes of first week mortality were determined pathologically and bacteriologically. And the coli isolates obtained from these birds were characterized genetically, pulse field gel electrophorezes, and multilocus sequence typing. Again, this is different ways of looking at the genome, getting a very distinct profile of these isolates. So this is a lot of data that we have obtained from these flocks in this project. Just to show you that isolation of E. coli was performed from the broiler parents, and you can see it's a lot of birds we have performed post-mortem on, and the coli again obtained, was stored and characterized. We made cloacal swabs from the newly hatched chickens from these breeder flocks, and we obtained, of course, E. coli isolates from the broiler houses associated this first week mortality, isolated the coli, made the genetic characterization, and obtained a very comprehensive data set in this respect. Some of the results so far have again clearly demonstrated that we do see transmission from the broiler breeders to the broilers. I'm not capable at this time saying how often and which subtypes of E. coli being the most important in this respect, but we will analyze for a long time on these data sets, and we will get some answers in respect to that. But as you see, at least, we have exactly the same subtypes occurring in the broiler breeders, causing salpingitis over here, and we have it in the hatchery, and we also have it in the broiler farm. So again, it's the same subtypes. appearing throughout the production pyramid. And you should remember in this respect, coli in any flock of birds are highly diverse. And that is, of course, very important when you look at these data and say, okay, could this be randomly occurring? No, because we would have a much more diverse picture, much more diverse population of E. coli if it really wasn't exactly the genuine vertical transmission we would see here. We have also observed that, and again this is not surprising, but it's documented at least, that we see horizontal transmission during hatching, at the hatchery. Our data support several times that what we see in the hatchery samples, different hatches, will also, as you see here at the very bottom, will also appear in the broilers. And different flocks. So we see, of course, a horizontal transmission at the hatchery also of these coli. Again, not surprising, but the more we can document, the more we can show, we also have possibilities for intervention at a later stage, of course. So, what we are capable of saying at this moment is that E. coli is the main cause of both salpingitis in the parents and first-week mortality in broilers. And again, also that E. coli dominated the bacterial flora of newly hatched chickens. We also have these identical genomes which support, of course, that this is a vertical transmission going on. We also, as we talked about, show this subsequent spread in the hatcher. And what perhaps is the most difficult part is that some single genome types dominated in one parent farm, and this type was also found in a newly hatched chicken and was the cause of first-week mortality. The distribution concerning these sequence types is still a puzzle. We know some are more important, more virulent, more aggressive than others, but it's very difficult still to understand this and why. But there is an interesting aspect, and that is that some of these subtypes, again, ST type 131, is commonly also isolated from human urinary tract infection. And we see more and more discussions in the literature about this potential zoonotic aspect of the APEC, the avian pathogenic E. coli. And we've seen that also with ST95, 10, and 5217, that they are also commonly associated human urinary tract infections. So this is a new aspect that we would be very interested in exploring a little bit more.